So what happens when a political fight in Washington, D.C. stops being about abstract policy and starts being about whether millions of people can literally put food on the table? Well, in November of 2025, a massive government shutdown pushed that very question to the absolute brink, creating a crisis of food, funds, and, well, the future of the country.
And just so you know, the story we're about to unpack for you is based on the incredibly detailed analysis of historian Heather Cox Richardson, who is documenting this whole thing as it went down.
At the very heart of this crisis is one staggering number: 42 million. That's the number of Americans who rely on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, you probably know it as SNAP, for their food. And they were caught right in the middle of a political firestorm.
So, how did we even get here? Well, the whole standoff started with a fundamental disagreement that brought the entire U.S. government to a grinding halt.
Okay, so here were the battle lines. On one side, you had House Republicans. They passed a funding bill, and that was it. They weren't going to negotiate. On the other side, Senate Democrats said, no way, not unless you also extend the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act, the program that helps millions of people afford health insurance. You had two sides that were completely dug in.
And when neither side is willing to budge an inch, what happens? The government shuts down. House Speaker Mike Johnson actually sent representatives home, which was a huge, high-stakes gamble, basically trying to force the Senate to cave.
And this is when a political strategy turned into a genuine humanitarian crisis. The administration decided to use an incredibly powerful and, frankly, painful pressure point: the nation's food supply for its most vulnerable people. So just a quick refresher. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is that federal lifeline. It provides the money for low-income families to buy groceries. It is absolutely essential for those 42 million people we just talked about. This was the move that changed everything. The administration announced that no, it would not use available reserve funds to pay out November's SNAP benefits. The goal here seemed pretty transparent: use the suffering of hungry Americans as leverage to pressure Democrats to back down on the ACA.
And you might be wondering, was the money even there? Oh yeah, as you can see here, the money was there. The country needed about $8 billion for November, but between an emergency reserve and a nutrition reserve, there was nearly $30 billion sitting there. Now, in past shutdowns, using these funds was standard practice. This time, a very deliberate choice was made not to.
Unsurprisingly, this decision was challenged almost immediately. The fight shot out of Congress and straight into the courtroom, kicking off this frantic, high-stakes legal battle.
And things just started escalating at a dizzying speed. First, a district court judge ordered the administration to release at least partial funds. When that order was ignored, he came back and demanded full payment. By Friday, the administration immediately appealed, and by late Friday night, the whole thing lands at the Supreme Court, where Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson hits the pause button with a temporary stay. It was total judicial whiplash.
So while all this is happening in the courts, on the ground, this legal back and forth was creating just massive confusion. It left states and the millions of people waiting for their benefits in a completely impossible spot.
See, in that brief little window before the Supreme Court stepped in, some states had already started sending out the money based on the judge's order. The federal government's reaction was fast and furious. A memo from the USDA landed, basically threatening those states, demanding they claw back any money that was already paid out.
This move prompted some incredibly sharp criticism. The journalist Catherine Rampell really captured the feeling, writing that it was, quote, astonishing how hard this administration is working to keep people hungry, and accusing them of trying to maximize public suffering for political gain.
But that federal threat was met with some absolutely stunning defiance. When Wisconsin's Governor Tony Evers was asked what he was going to do about the order to claw back benefits, his response was just one word: no.
As this whole drama was unfolding, the shutdown's effects were spreading, and it created this weekend of really starkly different realities for everyday Americans and for the people in power.
Yeah, it wasn't just about food anymore. The FAA started putting out warnings that with air traffic controllers going unpaid, Thanksgiving travel, which was just a few weeks away, was facing substantial disruptions. Suddenly, the crisis was beginning to touch nearly everyone.
And here's where that contrast really hits you. While millions of Americans were worried about their next meal and whether they could even travel for the holidays, President Trump was down at Mar-a-Lago hosting a ridiculously lavish dinner party, complete with scallops, beef fillet, and even ice sculptures.
The public disconnect was just impossible to ignore. That same weekend, the president went to an NFL game where he was loudly booed by the crowd, and this was happening right as reports were coming out that he wanted the team's new stadium to be named after him.
But the biggest shock of the weekend came from a totally unexpected place. Mark L. Wolf, a federal judge who was appointed by President Ronald Reagan, publicly resigned. He said he was doing it so he could speak out against what he called an existential threat to democracy and the rule of law.
And let's be really clear about this. This wasn't some kind of political chess move. Because of his senior status, Judge Wolf resigning didn't actually open up a seat for the president to fill. It was purely an act of principle, a protest against what he saw happening.
Which brings us to the final thought here. This whole crisis, from the shutdown to the fight over food stamps to a judge's dramatic resignation, it all forces us to ask a really difficult question. In a divided country, in a high-stakes political fight, where is the line? At what point does a political strategy cross over and inflict an unacceptable human cost? That's the question this weekend in November left a divided nation trying to answer.